wonderful to be here. Wonderful to see so many familiar faces. I know you didn't come just to see me or because you know me. You're really very big of a passionate interest in social license. And we will explore that during the course of the next few minutes. I should say that one of the wonderful features of Ferdinand's TSR series, and I have attended a number of the lectures here over the years, is that he provides very generous time allotments to the speakers. I'm quite used to having to compress what I have to say in about 10 or 15 minutes. My colleague Wes Craig over there and I are frequently encountered in cheap chairs, and it's never more than 15 minutes, and it's often more than 10. And while I can do that, and could do that today, I not only would be compressed, but it would probably come across as somewhat cryptic and not very informative. So I think with this generous time allotment, which is not only to my benefit, but I'd like to think also to your benefit, there will be lots of opportunity for you to state your positions or explore certain aspects of this particular subject, which as Kernahan indicated in his introductory remarks, really sort of is a point of entry into the whole broad spectrum of concepts and considerations related to corporate social responsibility. It is a term that I am probably equally blamed for, praised for. It is interesting that when I introduced this term in March of 1997, the details of that, it was really not terribly commonly used until the last 3 or 4 years. And I'm not really quite sure why it suddenly emerged, except that I think various people with various professions saw an opportunity that had been unexploited. And and it also actually emerged in the last several years, not around the issues with respect to which I originally introduced it, which was mining and its impact on communities and society and so forth, but around the issue of pipelines in Canada, oil pipelines and sometimes natural gas pipelines. And so I've heard politicians, Premier Clark, Premier Knockley, even Voltaire, Justin Trudeau, using the term social license without too much concern for what it might designate in the context in which they were using it, as being advantageous to make a particular political point. In recent years, I have had many exchanges of views with lawyers and people in think tanks and so forth, who are very concerned that this concept lacks any kind of legal validity, that it undermines the authority of governments in some respects. For those that are interested in promoting projects, it certainly slows that process down. And as Kernahan also indicated, it is extremely nebulously ill-defined. So hopefully, in the few words I have to share with you, without a little nebulosity, if I can use such a term, will dissipate, and you will at least have a little better understanding of what some of the borders might be around the content of this concept. Now, coincidentally, just recently, in my Globe and Mail, the quarterly edition of Corporate Knights arrived, and the cover story was on the future of mining. And in there, they have the little captions here, which you can hardly read, but one of them is taking up the social license. So there are many articles about the future of mining in here, but interestingly, one focuses on the future of mining with respect to social issues. And if you cannot read it, what it says is, the next big step forward is to stop thinking of social license as a cost. And the source of that particular quote was, I believe, an engineer, but someone who works with hatch engineers. So it didn't come from some CSR academic. They came from somebody that's actually trying to get projects done. And it was somewhat in that context that I introduced this concept initially. So I think you may find interest in this discussion, not only with respect to meaning of social license and how it is used, could be used, should be used, but also as to how a term, a phrase, a concept evolves. Because social license is a remarkable example of a single term, which, as I was showing you, has evolved into more than half a dozen different connotations, denotations, or applications. So in the history of the evolution of thought, I don't know how many of you are interested in that particular sort of history, but this will be an element that might appeal. You know, as I say, was surprised when I got the history of this concept, and I was not expecting that it would catch on in any manner. Certainly not in the way that it did. And when I reflect on that, the only thing I can think of is that it must be a term or a concept for which the time had arrived. There must have been some lacuna, some absence in the discourse about major projects, mining specifically in my case, that required some new kind of conceptual approach. And while, as I say, that conceptual approach has become quite variegated over the last 20 years, it's almost in March of next year will be exactly 20 years. It does seem to have been as a result of a need. And now the question I have, which I've been asking actually for the last couple of years, and the workshops on this particular subject, is whether the time of usefulness for this concept is past. And I'd like to think that you might be considering that yourselves as I go through this presentation. Has it outlived whatever value it brought to the discourse about mining and social responsibility? Now, I'll start by looking at this title slide. And I hope that you can see the background, which I think is quite beautiful. And this is a traditional village in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, before any major project has come anywhere in this vicinity, certainly no mine. And so you see the traditional dwellings, sort of circular reed or thatched huts, and they're laid out in sort of an organic pattern where people are comfortable living. And they're living in some sort of communion, I would think, with nature and each other. And that is useful, I think, to understand where I was when I introduced this concept, which was in March of 1997 at a World Bank conference on mining during the next 25 years. Now, trying to summarize the various sorts of activities that I was responsible for during my 30-year career in the mining industry. And most people in the company that I worked for did not have a very clear idea of what I was doing. In fact, many of them seriously questioned whether I should be working for that company at all. But in press, they'd say, oh, we kind of, helps us manage social and political risk, whatever it is. So we have risk, leave it to him. And in doing that, I established a fairly strong working relationship with staff of the World Bank that were involved in advising governments, particularly developing countries, about ways to sort of apply their resources for the purpose of the World Bank, which was sustainable development, poverty reduction. And gradually, by the mid-1990s, the bank was becoming very keen on the fact that mining in many developing countries can be a very significant wealth generator and could be a stepping stone to economic progress in many of those countries. I, meanwhile, was going to a lot of those countries, including Papua New Guinea, and been to villages such as I showed you, and finding that it was a very complex challenge that the bank was expecting us to address. And there are all sorts of cultural issues that you have to address, political issues, and so forth. And getting the permission of the government to develop a mine in those countries was not entirely adequate. We were living in a period where a lot was changing, and more of these countries are opening up to international investment, including in the mining industry. The mining industry, of course, is a very sensitive area of public policy concern in many developing countries. First of all, many of them have been exploited during the colonial period until shortly after the Second World War. The resources have just been stripped and taken away. And so one of the reactions to that, in many countries that received their independence or asserted their autonomy as countries that hadn't been under colonial rule but were exploited still by international companies. During the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was a period of resource nationalization. And very few mining companies were able to go to many developing countries to invest in extracting mineral resources. But in the 1990s, as globalization came about, and various bilateral investment treaties started being negotiated, and countries began to realize that simply being autarkic and trying to develop the resources of their economies on their own was not very effective, not very productive, and that they needed foreign capital. They started inviting mining companies in. We had a mining company, which actually had got its very earliest experience going back as far as its origins in 1920 in Papua New Guinea, was familiar with challenges of working in developing countries. So we were one of the companies, even though we were not the largest companies, we were number 10 in the world at the time, but one of the forefront of actually going into these newly opening developing countries for the first time. And we were very conscious of the fact that there was a lot of political instability in these countries. There was certainly a lot of ignorance and lack of knowledge about the mining industry. There was very poor regulatory or statutory instruments governing that industry. And not only that, but unlike almost any other industry that was investing in these countries, we were not working in the relatively comfortable and infrastructure endowed metropolitan areas. We were going to extraordinarily remote places. Places where actually in some places they hardly ever seen a non-national person. We were the first people from outside the country to show up in their neighborhood. And we discovered, of course, that these remote country communities were more or less ignored by their own governments. So when they saw us there, they saw a source of potential financial resources, potential technical resources, and perhaps a source of some improvement, though there was an awful lot of fear and trepidation and uncertainty with respect to newly arrived mining companies. But the opening of the developing world to globalization was one of the factors that accompanied the speech I gave on mining during the next 25 years. The other factor that related to globalization was that we were in the very early stages of what is now we call the communications revolution, I suppose. Social media didn't exist then, but we at least had the internet. So I don't know if I was even tied into the internet. I was sort of a late follower of some of those technologies. But there was a story going around World Bank circles at the time, which just woke everybody up. And it had to do with this exploration company that had been working in Papua New Guinea. And they'd been working in one of those remote areas, such as I showed you on the introductory slide. And the government of Papua New Guinea had said to them, Papua New Guinea was a late comer to independence in 1975, and they had the benefit of some of the wisdom that they'd accumulated by them with respect to drafting their constitution. And one of the facts that they put into the constitution, one of the stipulations, was that resources should be extracted in Papua New Guinea with the agreement of local communities. So the government of Papua New Guinea actually would tell us to go to that local community and make a deal. Making a deal is sort of a term these days, but anyway, that's what we were expected to do. So that exploration company, back in sometime in the mid-1990s, did that. And then a few months later, the same company was operating in the Amazon jungle of Brazil. And they encountered a local community, and they introduced themselves and explained what they were doing. And the immediate response was, we want that same deal that you gave that community in Papua New Guinea. Now, that was startling at the time. That was the internet at work. That was a global communications revolution. And that was just the beginning. Remote meant the communities were no longer isolated. It meant that mining companies were not operating sort of in a distant area where nobody knew what they were doing. But they were potentially subject to scrutiny by global critics whose access to information about what they were doing was rapidly growing. And not from official sources, from some person in the community that had some access to the internet. And you could get on and tell everybody what this company was doing. So the communities were beginning to communicate globally with potential allies among NGOs, among academics, with the media. And so while from one perspective they were powerless in their countries because their governments did not really relate to them, they were concerned about their welfare, what they were doing, they were developing power to the point that they could actually affect the operation of a mining company in their vicinity. So here was what I had to say at that World Bank conference on the future of mining. Not that social license was going to be so important, but that mining, to succeed, was going to be on a two-track approval process. The conventional track was to get a government permit. In order to sustain that permit, you had to maintain good relations with political leaders and comply with laws and regulations, because if governments change or if you're out of compliance, the government can lift your permit or impose costly fines. But also, you had to do something comparable in the local area where you were working, because the government authority and interests and abilities, in most cases, did not extend to those areas. So what was it you were doing? Well, you had to maintain good relationships with community leaders, and you had to comply with local expectations, and not only the leaders of the communities, but also, increasingly, with these allies that they were forming internationally through their connectivity. And if you failed to do that, you could probably encounter serious conflicts. Perhaps conflicts forceful enough to cause the suspension of your operations. So I needed some parallelism, and they simply said, well, if you get a government permit here, then what do you get there? You get a social license. I didn't call it community permit because it was broader than the community. It included those allies that gave the community power. So for that reason, I called it social license. I didn't call it permit, but just for the sake of variety, I used a virtual synonym, which is license. So, first point you need to know with respect to how we're going to explore the various meanings towards which the concept of social license has evolved, is that it wasn't introduced as a theoretical concept or a normative principle of ethics. It was introduced really as a concept in pragmatic political risk management. And it wasn't introduced prescriptively. I wasn't prescribing a social license. I was simply describing what it was that was actually happening. So that's how it originated. And it originated from the fact that there were power imbalances in many developing countries between the central government and rural communities, and mining companies operating in those countries were put in the position of trying to create some equilibrium, some balance. And it was there because, as I said, the growing power of communities has augmented by their global allies to affect the cost of mining operations. So it was a risk management tool. It was a cost containment tool. It was basically a tool, not a principle, not a norm, not a prescription. And it was presented quite essentially as a concept, as a descriptive term, whose relevance related to conditions in developing countries. When I introduced this term at the World Bank, it was meant to, of course, only extend to developing countries, never in my mind had any thought that it would be used with respect to Canada. Because in Canada, our communities, have governing authorities that have the ability to make decisions on their own behalf. They have their own relationships with the government. I wouldn't say that incorporated municipalities in Canada are ignored by the government. Far from it. We look at the current government's approach towards infrastructure projects and Canadian municipalities and so forth. So it didn't seem to be the same context at all. But of course, there was an element in which it was comparable. And that had to do with the Aboriginal communities in Canada, which were beginning to assert their ability to affect decisions as to whether projects would proceed or not. It was early stages. I mean, you think of how far our understanding of the rights and the entitlements and the power of Aboriginal communities in Canada has evolved since 1997. At that point, I think there were 2 mining projects in Canada where what we call an impact benefit agreement had been negotiated by the company. And it was just a way to sort of consolidate the relationship and satisfy the expectations there and get on with business. Now it's become a norm. So there was a relatively quick transfer of this concept to the notion that getting a government permit with all the regulatory apparatus for a mining project in Canada was not alone sufficient, that companies also needed to get some kind of agreement with Aboriginal communities if they were going to be affected by the project. And of course, given the traditional land use of Aboriginal people, some of these communities could be only 50 to 100 kilometers away from the project itself. But it would still be within what they considered to be their sphere of rights and entitlements. And in addition, another parallel to developing country governments with respect to their treatment of local communities, Canada's taking the treatment of Aboriginal communities, was that the governments were particularly unwilling themselves to sit down with these communities and negotiate some agreement with respect to a project. They would say to the companies, well, you need to go and talk to the community. Exactly the same kind of prescription that we got way back then and happened again. And why is that? Well, it's very obvious. I mean, there's 2 reasons, actually. One is, for a government, whether it's the federal government or provincial government, to sit down with an Aboriginal community in Canada to talk about a mining project, it's a very difficult conversation, primarily because you can't circumscribe the sphere of the conversation, of the discourse. Every issue that an Aboriginal community has relates to government. And so you can't say, well, we just want to talk about the environmental impacts of this mine and the potential benefit. No. We have to talk about cultural preservation. We have to talk about enhancing our languages. We have to talk about government respect for our rights. We have to talk. And so that's a very difficult conversation, and one that would probably take a lot longer than saying, company, you go and talk to these Aboriginals and come to a deal. That's basically what happened. So social license transferred to Canada was also transferred to Australia. It's quite interesting to me that in fact, it has not been picked up in the United States. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I received a telephone call from a lawyer in the US, an academic professor of law, who was looking at the Keystone XL pipeline issues, and he said, I've heard this concept of social license, which is all of that. It was not in the literature of the United States. And I was fascinated by that because, you know, if there's a company that understands social license from long experience in Canada, it's TransCanada. But that's a concept they would apply in Canada. Going to the US, it's different, we don't have to do that here. And the problems that TransCanada got into with the Keystone XL pipeline were basically what most people describe as social license issues. So he's written that up, and I think it's now sort of caught on. There's still sort of like, if anyone hasn't noticed here, the rarefied literature of academics and CSR law. But at least there's a beginning of that there. Okay, so I introduced the concept at this gathering at the World Bank. It was a small gathering, 50 people or so. And they were all talking about different aspects of the future of mining, much like this committee in Mark Knight's publication, which is 20 years later, the future of mining. And about 3 months later, I think in May of also 1997, the World Bank was doing another meeting. And this meeting was in Quito, Ecuador. I was invited to this meeting, but it was on the subject of mining in communities in Latin America. And I wasn't able to go because 4 or 5 other people in the company were regarded as more relevant to this particular topic, this particular region, where so I could say, oh, they don't need you. So these other people in the company went. Very well attended conference. There were several hundred people there. It was a major conference that left a deep imprint on many people's minds with respect to the advanced thinking that was going on about the role of relationship that mining companies have with communities and so forth. And the World Bank people started chatting, not in any formal presentation, but they mentioned, well, you know, we were saying something about social license. And there were a couple of friends of mine there who were not working for the company, although one had previously, who were consultants. And their names were Ian Thompson and Susan Joyce. If any of you are familiar with the CSR practitioners community, they've become quite famous over the last 20 years. They founded an organization called Common Ground. We do a lot of work working on resolving disputes between mining projects and communities and so forth. They heard this term as any really forward-thinking, insightful consultant. They saw a business opportunity. We can use this. So next thing I knew, I encountered Susan Joyce about a year later after my presentation back, and I said, what are you working on these days? She says, well, mostly on helping companies get their social licenses. What do you mean? How are you doing that? He says, well, you should know, you started the concept. At that point, that was the first realization I had that this thing had some legs, right? They weren't my legs. I actually didn't use the concept. As I said, it was a descriptive term for a particular set of circumstances, not a prescriptive term on what companies want to do, but they moved it into the prescriptive domain. And they put on a workshop in 1998 on how you were going to socialize it. And then they produced, Susan Joyce and Ian Thompson, in the Mining Journal, published in London, June 11, 1999, the first article on social license. They didn't reference me in this article, many subsequent articles have. And the title of the article is Earning a Social License. And so then it was in the literature, and then other consultants began to see a business opportunity. And the Australians picked it up, and the academics picked it up. But it was still not broadly used, not by the politicians, as it has been in the last 5 years in Canada. So that's how this little idea kind of got into the literature. And it goes way beyond anything I intended. In fact, you know, I was surprised. After I gave that presentation to the World Bank, one of the bank staffers came up to me and says, you know, I published several articles in the magazine with that into a story about resources policy. This will make a good resources policy article. And I said, oh, no, this is just a throwaway. I don't know an article about that. Now, do I not only regret that I had not written that article, but I wish I had trademarked the term. I think it's now so much in the public domain that can't be done. Now, I should say, I don't try to define social license. But I have identified what I consider to be 3 essential markers of what I would call social license. And the first marker is that there needs to be an ongoing structured process of consultation between the mining company and the local communities, together with the community allies. That, you know, in Latin America, well, the principal allies, self-appointed or invited, sometimes invited, are agencies of the Catholic Church. So we need to sit down with the Catholic Church and talk about that. That's one thing that led me to do that midlife Masters of Theological Studies degree that turned into reference. I'm not going to be talking to priests, pastors, even bishops, archbishops, because I really have a better idea of the normative background in which they're forming their opinions. And that has proven very useful, and gradually the industry has come to terms with that because in 2013, half a dozen CEOs of leading mining companies went to the Vatican to meet with the Pontifical Council on Justice and Peace to discuss the convergence, from their point of view, of best practices in mining with the Church's teachings on social justice. They didn't get very far, but at least they expressed their views. And they went back in 2015. So working with the allies of communities, because you know we can't just work with communities, has become embedded in corporate practices. So you need this ongoing structured process of consultation, which in ideal circumstances will be almost a joint decision-making about major issues that the company and the community need to resolve. It's not just an ad hoc, we're going to tell you what we're going to do, get your responses, and kind of integrate thinking with what we're doing. And a number of companies and a number of mines do have these kinds of structured ongoing processes. The second marker of social license is taking a precautionary approach. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the precautionary principle that was enunciated at the Rio Summit, Earth Summit in 1992, along with Sustainable Development Agenda 21. But the precautionary principle basically says that if there is a very low risk of a very high impact of what you're proposing to do, very high negative impact of what you're proposing to do, particularly very high negative environmental impact of what you're proposing to do, the fact that this is a low risk doesn't mean you can ignore it. It means you need to go to extra precautionary means of possibly anticipating, monitoring, and preparing to respond to that event if it should happen. Now, it's very interesting. The Mining Association of Canada has adopted the precautionary principle with respect to managing tailings ponds. So they have what's called, the Forum Sustainable Mining Tailings Management Protocol, which, quote, goes beyond regulatory compliance. And what it does is sets up a panel of experts that are continually monitoring the situation and listening to soft signals. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this mining tailings disaster we had in British Columbia called Mount Holly. Mount Holly had started to implement the voluntary mining tailings protocol, the Mining Association of Canada, but had not proceeded to full implementation. I would argue that had they done so, that tailings disaster might not have occurred. It was a very low risk, a very high impact event. And why might it not have occurred? Because they were forced to listen to soft signals. So when a disgruntled superintendent went to the mine management with his concerns, and he was rebuffed. Maybe the mine manager thought he was always struggled about one thing or another. He could go to this panel and they could not rebut him. They would have to follow up on what he was saying. When the company dropped one engineering consultancy company and chose another to work on a tailings facility, that was a salt signal. So listening to salt signals and doing whatever is feasible as a way of preparing for the most undesirable and generally unforeseeable event is the application of a precautionary approach. And then finally, I think the third marker would be some kind of mutually agreed plan to optimize the economic benefits of the mine to all communities. I use the term optimize, not just throwing money. I mean, this does happen in many parts of the world where you simply basically drive a community to provide development business. And of course what happens actually is that the haves get a lot more of that money than the have-nots in the community. The wealth gap widens, the conflict increases, and you actually end up in a very counterproductive situation. So this means optimize the distribution of benefits, and actually what that would mean ideally is narrowing the wealth gap in those local communities rather than extending it. Now, let me move on to, and I'll go through this fairly rapidly, but it is really, I think, the part of the presentation that I hope you find stimulating. How this term social license has evolved is set to the content, to what it designates within different contexts. And the context in which it's evolved are corporate social responsibility, that framework of thinking has a certain meaning. Sustainable economic, environmental, social development, that framework, another certain meaning. Community rights and entitlements, particular meaning there. Social justice, by which we mean distributional justice and procedural fairness, another meaning there. Evolution, decision-making power of government. A new social contract that legitimizes corporations by redefining their obligations to society. And finally, social license has evolved to designate any broad public policy issue that is not addressed in governmental processes or industrial projects. In other words, you can use it to say anything, and that's basically how the politicians are using it. Sustainable development. The classical definition of sustainable development, which was originally formulated earlier, but it's usually used as a reference, is the text of Our Common Future, which was produced under the auspices of the UN Commission for Environment and Economy, 1988, written by Willy Brandt. Development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And if you look into the literature, United Nations literature, Rio Summit, it emphasizes that it is an ongoing process. Sustainable development is not an outcome. The term sustainability might be more close to an outcome idea. But it's an ongoing process for integrating and harmonizing the environmental, socio-cultural, economic, and governance dimensions of the reality around a mining project, or any project actually, industrial project. And this implies an ongoing engagement of local communities about current impacts and future needs, and that essentially is the process of sustaining a social license to operate. You can look at the term in the context of community rights and entitlements, a more ethical and normative approach to understanding the terms, perhaps. And I take this statement from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, very recent, very substantial and advanced document produced by the member nations of the United Nations. And it states that states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned for their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories or other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of minerals, water, or other resources. So here, social license is implicitly stated as being the right of communities, in this particular case, traditional and Aboriginal communities, to decide their own future. And the question arises immediately, why do we stop there? And, you know, in this country it's very interesting. I work on several projects where there's an Aboriginal community, and it's living right next door, quite literally. So non-native. Example, Fort St. James, from British Columbia. We have the Cosley First Nation, the non-native community. And then Cosley gets, because of the circumstances that exist, not just social license issues, but legal issues in Canada, a different treatment from the other community. And this is not a very good situation, actually. Certainly it's a pragmatic community relations management challenge. So the question is, does free, prior, and informed consent, is it going to evolve? Is social license within that way of thinking going to evolve to include all communities? Right now we have a very interesting case in British Columbia, what's called the Kinder Morgan Pipeline. Using not a greenfield project, brownfield project, doubling the size of a pipeline from Alberta down to the lower mainland. And of course, the pipeline company is going in talking to all the First Nations. But they've got this huge negative reaction from Burnaby and Vancouver. They're not getting at all the same attention. And who, according to the government, do not have a place at the table. Well, it's going to be interesting. Actually, Vancouver is trying to go to the courts to see whether they do have greater entitlement. But if I were Kinder Morgan, I was interviewed about this a couple of years ago. I said, if I were Kinder Morgan, I would have established a community consultative process, certainly in Burnaby, on the markers of social license. I would have, in that discussion, have introduced the concept of a precautionary approach. How do we go beyond what the NED is going to prescribe as the regulatory limits for this particular project in order to satisfy your particular concerns about what we consider low risk, but for you would be high impact projects? And how do we optimize the economic benefits? It seems like a simple thing to do, but that conversation never took place, and they're working to have the smarts to do that. But now we're in a situation that's probably just going to end up being increasingly conflictual. Then we get into the notion of social justice, sphere of ethics, distributional fairness, procedural fairness. Well, as I said, I certainly didn't think of social license as being prescriptive, but it has now sort of moved into this realm of discourse. It focuses on what share of benefits and risk from a mining project, or as they say, a mining industrial project, should go to investors, communities, governments, employees. What is the distributional fairness here? And then what is a generally acceptable process for deciding the distribution of benefits, not only of benefit, but the distribution of risk? Key ethical questions. So obtaining a social license within this frame of reference would imply a fair process of consultation in communities on benefits and risk as a matter of social justice. The underlying theme is that communities, in some manner, have a right to be consulted and maybe even to be the decision makers on projects that affect them environmentally, socially, and economically. That's an ethical perception. A lot of people think ethics is subjective. Well, you might think that, that's your view. But my ethics are different. I think that one of the big challenges of our time is to objectify ethics for challenging project. Now we get into actually the more controversial aspects of what Greta had called this contested concept. Social license is an aspect, a description, if you want, of what is currently occurring with respect to the devolution of the powers or authorities of government to make resource development decisions. And there are various aspects of this deterioration, if you want to call it, there's an evolution of the authority of government. One is that, the Costco government contains the right to eminent domain, which means for the good of society, government can make decisions that override personal or communal interests for the benefit of the common good. Well, eminent domain is increasingly difficult to oppose, and I don't know if any government today, North American, would actually invoke eminent domain. I mean, that's come up. People say, well, U.S. government could invoke eminent domain to override those social issues around the XL pipeline. Or maybe Canada will have to invoke eminent domain to get the Energy East pipeline built. But that ability to assert governance has very much weakened. And then we're under all sorts of pressures for consultative processors to broaden the issues that are going to be concerned or centered in major party decision processes. I mean, in the modern democracies, there's this tension that has arisen that all of you are aware of between representative government and direct democracy. And direct democracy means, okay, we can't decide it here, we're going to go to a referendum. And you see what happens when that occurs. I mean, that's our experiences of that in the UK, just had a disastrous experience with that. So are we going into a devolution of government such that representatives can no longer feel that they have the authority? And actually strengthening the voting process would be a good thing, because majority government represented by 40% of the people, automatically question if they really have the authority to make such a major decision about our future. And then there's another interesting aspect of the devolution of the authority of government. And it is not that devolution is an unfortunate situation or something that's sort of inevitably happening or the response of public pressures, but that it is a good thing that there's a principle that means that governments should devolve authority and decision-making powers to lower levels of society. And that principle is called subsidiarity. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the principle of subsidiarity, although when the European Union was being formed, Margaret Thatcher used to refer to it frequently as being a principle that would have to be recognized to preserve Britain's relative autonomy in governing authority. To use a secular definition. Recently, Pope Francis last year issued an encyclical Laudato Si, English translation entitled Care for Our Common Home, which once again embraces and emphasizes the importance of the principle of subsidiarity. Now, that principle was first enunciated in Christian social doctrine in 1931 by Pope Pius XI to oppose the development of totalitarianism, which was occurring in Russia, which was occurring in Italy, which was about to occur in Germany. To say, no, all decisions shouldn't be concentrated at the power at the top. They should be put at the lowest competent decision-making authority, because that's where human beings can actualize their abilities and themselves and their vision for their future. And subsidiarity actually would dictate that governments should have less authority in making these major decisions, that communities should have maximum authority, and that social license is the norm. So thank you, Pope Francis. Then another conceptual context for this term is the social contract. I know there are some friends of mine academics, ethicists, would say, you know, thinking about the social license issue is really just another way of expressing the social contract. And in some respects, that may be right. Now, I guess most of you have some understanding of what we mean when we say social contract for business corporations. The social contract is basically the expectations that society generally has with respect to how a business corporation will perform. What's permitted, what's not permitted, what is hoped for or looked for. And it's not something that is produced by legislation, probably different formulations of it. But the formulation I'm going to introduce here is what I would call probably the minimalist definition of social contract. And that is that the responsibility of business is to maximize profits for investors, for shareholders, for owners, within certain constraints. The constraints of laws and regulations, the constraints of public perception, which you don't want to wake up to a whole bunch of very negative headlines, that can be costly, and the constraints of ethical convention. So you don't want to do something that would offend the general moral sense of society. I don't know if you're familiar with that particular definition of the social contract that was enunciated in mid-1918, 1975 by Milton Friedman. So it's got some eminent authority behind it. But as I say, it's a minimalist definition. And there are people that say, well, companies should do more than that. I don't know how many investors think a company should do more than that. But let's assume that that's a social contract. Now, what's happened in the mining industry, very interestingly, and I think this is the only industry that has actually done this, in the late 1990s, it came to the conclusion that that particular social contract, which is actually the intuitive understanding of business by most every CEO I've ever met, that particular social contract did not work that well for mining. That it led to mistrust. It led to concerns about environmental and social impacts that perhaps for the benefit of the shareholders, mining was doing less to prevent those from happening. And therefore, the mining industry went into a major transformation of what I would call its global social contract by adding an additional constraint. It says, we will do what we need to do to maximize the benefits, returns, the profits of the shareholders. But we will also do it within the constraint of sustainable development. That is, we will do it with kind of an equal respect for the environmental and social dimensions of our impacts as well as the economic aspects. And we will do it with respect for future generations, what will happen after we finish mining. And so they had a new constraint. Now it's interesting, I don't know how many mining industries, but how many mining companies, how many mining officials would actually say, yeah, it is a constraint. Because you know, what you have is not a constraint, it's actually an attribute, it's something good. We don't want to say we're constrained by sustainable development, we've embraced it, we're promoting it, you know. But if you look at it really, it's a risk management tool as are the other three constraints. And it's there to sort of say, well, okay, we're different. Here's how you should understand this. And it is there to basically provide a toolkit, and that's basically how the mining industry has used it, to provide a whole set of tools for what we need to do about this issue or that issue and other issues. You mentioned the Mining Tailings Protocol of the Mining Association of Canada, which are all part of the way in which they instrumentalize or implement sustainable development. But there's a tension in the system. And actually, I can find it. I want to read very quickly. And I'm almost finished for those of you that really want to jump in and make your points. In this issue of corporate knights, I think I can find it here very quickly. Where Richard Ross, former CEO of a mining company, now on faculty at York University, said, well, basically what he said was, the major challenge facing mining, yeah, here it is, Richard Ross. Finding the right balance between various stakeholders is the single biggest challenge any mining company CEO is dealing with today. Distributional justice. Who gets the benefits? Employees, shareholders, communities, governments. Mining company has become a very interesting sort of transactional nexus of all this wealth that is generated and the distribution of that. Governments have been reluctant to sort of prescribe the distribution that they would prefer. But this is creating a tension so that it's not, there's almost a felt need for a new social license. And I would say that when you talk about the future of mining, the social contract will evolve to kind of incorporate that sustainable development dimension into the actual priority of what the company is doing. So rather than simply maximizing investment for shareholders, a mining company, maybe any resource development company, mining company, natural gas company, oil company, hydroelectric company, atomic energy company, maybe any large industrial enterprise, ultimately, exists to optimize the distribution of benefits and risks for investors, communities, governments, and employees within the constraints of law, regulations, public perception, and prevention. Now, we're not here yet, but I feel that we're kind of in this intermediate zone where we're moving from one concept of what the responsibility of the company is to another. And the practice is preceding the conceptualization, interestingly enough, as Richard Ross said, is finding that balance between the benefits and the risk distribution for the different stakeholders. And then finally, as I suggested, the term social license has lost almost all meaning. And it's come to represent almost anything one wants it to represent. Now, I don't know if you can read this, it's maybe not the best example here, but anyway, this was a big cartoon in the Globe and Mail. Some of you may have seen this in the last number of weeks. I missed it, but it was sent to me for some reason. Anyway, so here's the leader of a large number of protesters representing all sorts of different constituencies. And they're obviously protesting the Energy East Pipeline project. And I would interpret the two individuals there as being Rachel Knockley and Justin Trudeau.